and I'll be chairing. But if we just go round quickly, we can tell you our names, our podcast, and what we're up to. So I'm one of the hosts of Gorilla Science Presents. I'll pass it on. Kat?
Oh, okay. So I'm Kat Arney. I'm a science writer, broadcaster. I'm the creative director and founder of First Create the Media, and we are a science communications company. We make 3 podcasts at the moment: Genetics Unzipped for the Genetic Society, Hormones: The Inside Story for the Society for Endocrinology, and the Suffrage Science podcast for the London Institute of Medical Sciences Suffrage Science Scheme. Before that, I've been a long-time broadcaster and podcaster. Started with The Naked Scientist, doing the Naked Genetics podcast. I made the Cancer Research UK podcast in 2006 before people really listened to podcasts. And I've also made multiple BBC Radio 4 documentaries and series. And my current series, Ingenious, is broadcasting this week at lunchtimes on Radio 4. So that's me.
Amazing. And Anne, how about yourself?
Thanks, Rachel. So I'm Anne. I'm a PhD student, first and foremost, in agriculture crop science. And I'm also the host and the founder of the Root of the Science podcast. So basically, the purpose of the podcast is to interview Africans in STEM all over the globe and to give them the platform to share their stories and to find out why they got into the science, and also create visible role models for other people about the different streams of science, and also just show people who look and sound like you to get into science. So yeah, that's about me.
Amazing. And last but not least, Anna.
Hello, I'm Anna Przajski. I'm a material scientist by training, turned science communicator, presenter, author, and podcaster. I've been running my podcast, which is called Handmade, for about 4 or 5 years now. And in it, I interview craftspeople and artists about the materials and processes that they use. And it's supposed to be kind of a conversation between me as the scientist and them as the artist. So yeah, that's me.
Awesome. And I guess I should also mention that I'm also doing a PhD in neuroscience. So I came at the podcast from the scientist angle, as well as working on some of the production behind the scenes. So we've got a bunch of questions to get through. We're just going to have a chat, basically. But then later on, we'll have plenty of time for audience Q&A. So if anything comes up, have a little think. And yeah, don't be shy. It'd be great to hear from you. So the first question is, how and why did you start your podcast? So I think I'm really curious to hear from your perspective, because you're bringing in so many things with your podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. So the main reason, I'll try and make it short, was that I was doing my master's was in 2020. I was finishing off actually, and there was this pressure of us publishing papers. And I understood the pressure, but then I was also like, okay, and then what? And then what happens when I publish these papers? Because in my master's degree, I was working a lot with small scale farmers. Like I said, I'm an agriculture scientist. And I felt like there was a bit of a gap in terms of the science that I've been doing for 2 years and the people who are actually on the ground. So I wanted to create a platform to sort of bridge that gap. To be honest, I didn't even know there was a thing called science communication. I didn't even know. I didn't even know what that was. But I got into Twitter and I met some really amazing people, and there was this whole idea of science communication. And I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. Then after that, another major reason was that when I was growing up, I have to put a disclaimer. I never wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to be a lawyer. And that goes because of the shows that I used to watch. I was actually telling a friend of mine that I used to watch, there's a show called Boston Legal back in the day. And I was like, oh my word, I want to be one of those people. And I mean, when I was in high school, there were suits and all of that stuff. So I saw these type of people of what lawyers would look like. But when I saw scientists, it was usually old people who didn't really look like me. So I wanted to sort of bridge that gap where we talk about the science that anybody can understand it, and also because I feel like people research for such a long time, and also create visible role models. And what better way than having an African scientist wherever you are based, whether even if you aren't necessarily born in Africa, but you you're part of the diaspora, or you have some sort of connection to Africa. And to show a young African child that, listen, you are not limited to where you are. This is where you can be. You can be from Malawi and you can go and study in Spain, or you can be from South Africa and you can go and study in Russia. Like, you are not limited. So in all of that, it will show the diversity. And that another important thing was that when I thought of scientist, I always thought doctor, engineer. But then through my podcast and meeting all of these amazing people, like Anna, she's a material scientist. I don't even know what that is, a neuroscientist. So people like that these are the careers that are actually out there. So those were the major drivers, and I'm really grateful that I have the honor and the pleasure to create that medium to interview all of these people and to share stories and inspire others to get into science. So that's the major driver for me.
Amazing. And Anna, the mysterious material scientist, was part of your motivation, kind of bringing, what you do to the world. Really interested to hear how and why you got started up.
So my podcast kind of started actually through a huge crisis of confidence as a material scientist. I'd done my undergraduate in it, I was doing my PhD, and I thought of myself as this expert. I'd done all this studying, like surely I was being looked at as the expert in materials. And then I had this huge crisis when I realized that I started to meet artists and craftspeople who actually knew way more about materials than I did. A blacksmith who can actually forge a piece of steel in their blacksmith's workshop. I knew none of that. I knew the theory, I knew it all on paper, fine, but I didn't have any of these like tangible, useful hand skills. So that's why I started interviewing these people that clearly had a huge breadth of knowledge about materials, but from a totally different aspect from me. So I interviewed potters on clay, blacksmiths on steel. I've interviewed a baker about foams. I've interviewed a nuclear waste enthusiast about nuclear waste. And through that, I was sort of trying to fill in these gaps in my knowledge that my kind of formal material science education couldn't tell me. So as I say, the podcast at its best is a conversation between art and science, and really through materials showing that there are two ways of looking at the same thing.
And Kat, like, you've worked on so much, like, what was the center of that big bang before the explosion?
So I think for me, for podcasts, it's about the medium, like the power of audio to actually engage people in stories. And I'm just absolutely passionate about the medium of partly radio, but actually really podcasting as being this portable story medium that you have in your head, and you can be doing something else. You can be walking around, you can be doing the ironing, you can just be lying in a darkened room. I listen to podcasts while I'm in the shower. It's this audio medium that you take with you, and that makes it incredibly intimate, fascinating, engaging the brain while kind of the rest of your body is interested doing something else. And the power of it for communicating stories, science, and what's always driven me in all the podcasts that I've made, whether it's been for a client or whether it's been something that we've started, say at CR UK kind of organically, it's like, there's so much cool and interesting stuff. There's so many interesting people, so many interesting stories. This is a really great way of like engaging on a deeper level with them. But also, we've made a number of different podcasts for clients. We've also had a lot of people approaching us to make a podcast. And I always say, like, why do you want to do this? Why is audio the medium to communicate this content or to reach the audience you want to reach? And, quite often I find myself saying, as someone who makes podcasts, it's like, I don't think you should make a podcast. I think that you should, maybe your director or your boss is saying, oh, let's do a podcast. And actually that's not the right way to engage the audience with the material that you're trying to communicate. But yeah, if you've got like fascinating stories and people kind of starting a grassroots podcast, it's like deep personal interest that you bring that no one else really brings, and the deep connections and the fascination, that just makes compelling storytelling and compelling audio. And then also, Rachel, how about you?
Oh, you got me. So when Guerrilla Science Presents got started, I was an assistant producer for Guerrilla Science. We've been running for about 15 years, and generally if people know us, it's for live events. People might follow our newsletter, but it's at festivals, it's, out and about where you least expect us. So we kind of went into 2020 like, yeah, let's go. We've got our like summer lineup ready. And then, oh no, there's a virus. So it was a real like reaction to just not only how are we still able to reach people online, but also we've got all of this stuff that happens in one or a few places a year, every year. How can we like share that in a broader way, in a way that's actually effective? So it started out for us just, we had some audio recordings from previous events and we kind of put them online just as a kind of testing ground. But it didn't feel like that was the right way for us to like actually bring guerrilla science to the airwaves. But more importantly, it wasn't the right way to communicate the science that was occurring during those events. So we went away and we had a good long think about it and decided we'd just do a short series. So it's 4 episodes, but we really wanted to touch on the topics that we think, you know, have a really big impact when people get in touch with them, people are interested in them, and potentially they're a way for us to play with those ideas to see, is there something more that could come out of this down the line? So I think our kicking off Guerrilla Science Presents was partially exploration, partially a bit of R&D, but also just finding out a way to bring that, to bring the science and the fun in a way that's just much more accessible for everybody, regardless if there's a pandemic going on or not. And just going back to what you were saying, Kat, about, you know, is the right thing to do to start a podcast? One of the questions that we've got is for people thinking of starting a new podcast, what are the key questions that you have to answer? So for instance, why do you want to start a podcast at all? And I just wondered, for everybody, are there more questions that you'd add to that? Like, I guess for me, it would be like, you know, how do you want to use the podcast as an opportunity to kind of broaden the way you think about what you do? Because that's what it did for me.
And one question I always ask with any piece of communication that I'm doing is like, you know, who would listen to this?
Yeah.
You know, it's and I think it's interesting because the very best podcasts, you almost don't realize that you want to listen to it until you listen to it. It's like, I'm absolutely fascinated by this, by this world, or the way that this person engages, or the kinds of people that they have on. And I think the worst podcasts are that kind of thing where the powers that be have said, we should have a podcast and it should be us interviewing the boring friends that I have. That's no, I mean, like, who is going to listen to that? But, you know, if you are passionate and interested about something that's cool and interesting, or you have interesting and passionate people, it's like, yeah, people will listen to that. You know, make something that you are interested in listening to.
Yeah, I always think if I'm bored, then whoever's listening is definitely bored.
No one has to listen to this, really.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Especially with podcasts. Definitely. Like, there's a lot of podcasts. No one has to listen to any of them.
For sure. I think, Kat, your point about who is the audience is super important. And there are lots of audiences for whom podcasts is not the right medium. There's also the side of it that it's not podcasts. It's a kind of, you know, they're a serial. They're usually relatively short, although not necessarily. There's obviously no visuals. All of these factors can contribute to your question of, is this the right medium for me? Actually, it could be videos. It could be, you know, a longer form single standalone audio piece. It could be a written piece. There's all these other things you have to think about. And first and foremost, it has to be what's the right thing for the audience.
And it's about the purpose it served. Like, Anne, I was really interested hearing from you about you to show people like you know, to help people kind of hear me in this, to see what you can be. What rings true to you?
Yeah, no, definitely. Like you said, well, I have to say, when I was starting this podcast in South Africa, I started last year in 2020. It wasn't that big. I didn't even know what I was getting myself into, to be quite honest. And everybody asked me, why a podcast? Why not a YouTube channel? Because that's what everybody was doing at the time. So for me, I personally felt the reason was because I love to speak. And I didn't quite like the pressure that came with having to put on makeup. So if you're an introvert, you know, you kind of have to look at your personality. You know, do you like to be in front of the camera? Are you comfortable in front of the camera? Some people are actually better if you are behind the camera and your personality comes through. I know even with guests as well. So you kind of also need to look at yourself internally. What type of person are you? How do you communicate effectively? If you are shy, you know, maybe this is the perfect way. And I've seen so many people who seemingly are shy, but then once they get on the mic, it's like you're a completely different person. And I love that as well. Like I just love that switch. You know, you can take yourself into there. And also another great thing is that it really helps with your communication skills. It really helps you in so many other different ways. So you kind of build confidence. And so my takeaway would be, apart from just showing people the reason of like all of these amazing scientists, but a personal choice was my personality. I really needed to assess that. So just don't do a podcast because Kat or Rachel are doing podcasts and they're great. But if you are really good with speaking on the mic, you know, that'll be really something that you can turn into.
I will add that you can get, you know, there's podcasts that people just make because I want to have this vehicle to communicate the stories that I want to communicate to the world. If you're thinking about it from more like an organizational perspective, it's like it is a type of content. And then you can actually, through that content, it gives you fuel for other types of content that then you're kind of building on the story. You can turn podcasts into blog posts or bits of social media and all this kind of thing. So it's like, okay, this is my vehicle for how I want to tell these stories to the world. And it is, you can then kind of slice and dice it in different ways. So there's a bigger, you know, what will this piece of content do for you or your organization as well, that can be quite useful to think about. Because it's a lot of time and effort to make a podcast.
That is very true.
Yeah.
And I guess we can get a little bit into the nitty gritty of getting a podcast running. We've talked a bit about, you know, how your vision for the podcast will affect your approach. I guess one of the big questions for people is, how do you get in guests? And not, you know, not just like, how do I send an email, but like, how do I find guests? How do I book them? I wondered, where to begin. There's just so much stuff you could go into.
I want to hear from Anna. I want to hear how you find blacksmiths.
Yes.
So actually the blacksmith example is really interesting. I was listening to, this is a good example of how to find guests. I was listening to Women's Hour and they were talking about their crafts prize. And I was like, aha, I'm looking for crafts people. They had sort of a series of these finalists. And one of them was this woman called Agnes Jones, who was a blacksmith up in Glasgow. And I was like, she sounds really cool. So I just found her on the internet and I sent her an email and I was like, hello, I think you sound really cool. I'd really like to talk to you. And that's another good thing about podcasts. If you're doing an interview podcast, it gives you a reason to meet and contact and talk to people. So I was able to say, not only like fangirl this person who I thought was really cool, but say, I'd love to talk to you on my podcast. And we're still actually quite good pals now. If I've ever got a question about Spiel, I'll just send her a WhatsApp message. So that's one way. And once you've got your, I'm sure other panelists will think of other ways. I'll just add one more thing, which is that once you've got a kind of a core, say your first 5 or 10 episodes, 5 or 10 guests, you can then start asking them, you know, is there anyone that you know that you could recommend who either does similar work to you, or, you know, if they're a good speaker, you know, similar kind of vibe. So I've got a lot of my guests as recommendations from previous guests.
I mean, I Google a lot, but we're, particularly for Genetics Unzipped, we make things around themes. So, you know, we'll have a theme of try and find a couple of guests that all fit together in the same kind of theme. So yeah, but usually those themes are driven by me reading or spotting something interesting on Twitter. You know, I'm constantly trying to like scan around for what do I find interesting, and then who are the interesting people. I follow a lot of scientists on Twitter and do a lot of Googling. And it is sometimes, and maybe we could talk a bit about this, like the challenge is sometimes if you've only got a limited number of guests and a really limited time frame, because you know you have to get your podcast out on a certain day because it has to be regular, and you set up, you know, interviews with 3 women or 2 women or people of color, and then they all drop out and you end up with like, oh, we've just got 3 white guys again. Making sure that you can try and get the right diversity is a really constant challenge with like infinite time and infinite resource. it's something that I aspire to but don't always hit. So I'd be interested to hear how other people follow that challenge.
I just wanted to add about your Twitter thing before we go on it. I think Twitter or any other social medias or Instagram or Facebook, I think those have been really beneficial. So going on them and dropping people DMs, like the worst thing that people can say is no or not now, or rather try this person. So I think you shouldn't be too shy. And I know some people are like, what if that person's DMs aren't open? You can just pop them a message and say, hi, can I message you? Like, you really just have to put yourself out there and just be it takes a lot, but you should try. And social media for me, and like you said, Google, but I'm a DM queen. I love it. I stand by it.
Sliding in the DMs.
I am always going to slide in the DMs. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on that topic, that social media is so important in getting guests, and just don't be afraid to message people. Usually they usually say yes.
I think your point as well, if they can't do it, who else could do it that they know? And then you sort of broaden your network too.
Yeah, and it's not just individuals with, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Rachel. It's not just individuals with profiles that you can target as well. There's quite often accounts that will celebrate, the one that I'm thinking of is Black Makers, and they are, a conglomerate of people that are Black and do crafts and making. And they celebrate the crafts that those people make. And so there are those kinds of accounts that you can tap into as well. And you can start following people off that, and if find their work and DM them from there.
And I think if you do find specifically an academic who looks really cool, I always like to then go onto their department or university's website. And if they're the head of a lab, you can see who else works in the lab. And sometimes you'll find somebody who's actually much more appropriate, is an early career researcher. And usually we're all really keen to do something that's not just being in the lab or doing science, as much as I love that. So yeah, definitely don't just stop at the head of the lab, their PI, the principal investigator. Keep digging and delving, because you might find some people who are really cool. And again, for academics, there's so much knowledge outside the Russell Group. Don't just limit yourself to Russell Group universities, and even don't just limit yourself to other people from the UK. The great thing about a podcast is you can record people from everywhere. So, take that as much as you can. But I think going back to Kat's question on diversity, it's such a good question, because like you said, it's hard enough sometimes just getting diverse people in a room together, but also on top of that, it's figuring out who do I need for this conversation in particular on top. And that's something that I've always tried to think about, who needs to be in this conversation who's usually excluded. And I think with Guerrilla Science Presents, that was something we always tried to do, was to bring the science in. So we did, our first episode was all about sex in the pandemic. And we spoke to Dr. Nan Wise, who's an amazing neuroscientist, who specifically looks at the regions of the brain that are involved in the orgasm and involved with pleasure. But having that scientific perspective, I thought, was one part of the story. So we also brought in an influencer online, a sex positive influencer. And we also brought in a collective of sex workers to have a discussion as well. And it's just thinking, right, I kind of know what I know. I know there's definitely some neuroscience about sex, but what don't I know? And who should I be talking to? And how can I bring them in a way that makes sense? So I think, around diversity, it's the who, but it's also the expertise. And if you can combine those, that's just cherry on top. But obviously, that's just my opinion. Yeah. Oh, Anne, are you muted, or did you want to say something about bringing in diverse speakers as well?
Well, I think for me, I'm sort of privileged in terms of my podcast is very broad. Of course, it is limited in the sense of Africans, but I think the main reason why is because I felt that there wasn't a lot of spaces, and I didn't see a lot of spaces for that. So I'm really fortunate in terms of when I have guests, I try to have different sorts of people, male, female, white, black, Indian, so that's the beauty of it. And like you said, the combination of diversity and expertise is really, really very, very important. And it's something that one always has to keep in the back of your mind.
So again, like, we've got time at the end for audience questions if there's anything else that anyone wants to chip in. But I think if we carry on thinking about how do you get that podcast off the ground, we've kind of hinted at how much work goes into the planning. And yeah, just what are the things that people maybe don't think about when they have the idea of planning a podcast? And I'd love to start with you, Kat, if you've got anything in there.
I mean, so one of the first, so after the decision of like, is a podcast the right thing to be doing? The first thing is then thinking about the format, because there are different types of formats of podcast. I mean, at Genetics Unzipped, we actually have a bit of a weird one where we alternate episodes that are interviews, usually 2 or 3 interviews, with then this narrative story, going back through the stories from the history of genetics with music and sound effects and things, because those are the kinds of podcasts I wanted to make, basically. But, you can have an interview-based thing, you can have a narrative one, you can have a monologue. You can also have what I like to call, I think, banter casts, which are basically a few people sitting around bantering, and everyone's like, oh yeah, that's the easiest podcast to make. You just get all your mates in a room and you all just chat. And it's like, no, that sounds shit. You have no idea how those, the best banter casts that you listen to, things like No Such Thing as a Fish. It's like the amount of planning that goes into that to work out who's going to talk about what, how are we going to structure this discussion so that it is actually something interesting to listen to. So it's always the planning is like, what's going to be interesting to listen to, whether that's the format, the topic, the people that you have, the stories that you're covering. That does really take time and planning out, for sure, and a lot more time and planning than people expect. It doesn't just, podcasts don't really just happen by magic, certainly not good ones.
Definitely.
Definitely. And also, I would like to just add that after you've decided and you have started recording, another thing which I think is the marketing of your podcast, especially if you're doing it by yourself. You have to, there's so much work in that, creating, for example, the promo content, like how to create those little snippets. I think those are the things that people don't really understand, that's something that you also have to do. And another thing is, even when your podcast is released, this is something that I caught myself, was that your audience, how are they going to receive it? Your hearing impaired audience, do you need transcripts? Those are the sorts of things that you don't think, because you always assume that everybody is going to just listen, but there are some people who are interested in what you're doing, but they have some, hearing impairments, and putting that in and making it accessible for everyone, because I think that's what you'd want your show and your content to be, very accessible. So I think that's another thing that I recently learned.
I can add to that as well, is particularly if it's like useful science content, is that increasingly with things like Genetics Unzipped, we find that they're being used as teaching resources in schools and universities. And so we've always done a full transcript of everything. And it's a pain, because even the auto transcribers, you have to go through and check it, because, it's kind of nonsense half the time. And that takes time. And then putting it up on a website takes time. And like you say, making the audiograms and the promo takes time. But actually, if you do care about the material and making sure that it is accessible and also searchable through Google, you can search for written word. At the moment, we can't search by audio content. That may change. But yeah, it's just a way of increasing findability and access to your content, and also if it is usefully educational.
Those are really great points.
I think taking that back to the question of, the idea of sitting in the space and thinking about starting a podcast, one of the things I wish I'd thought about more was, how many people do I need to help me here? Can I do all of this producing, recording, editing, advertising all on my own? It's, like we said, a lot of work. And if I did it again, I would probably try and bring on more people, either as co-hosts or as co-producers, just to try and share that workload a bit.
Yeah, like working in the team was just a complete game changer. Like just the ability to have, some of us focusing on the upcoming episodes, some of us editing, like made a massive difference. So yeah, teamwork definitely makes the dream work. I guess we've chatted a little bit about social media. Are there any promo tools that you guys think are the best? Like for me, like social media was the biggest one, definitely, but also I was surprised how many people click through from our newsletter and things like that. So any other unexpected champions of getting people to tune in?
I mean, Anne mentioned it, but making little audiograms. So there's a tool called Headliner. It's free to use, and you basically you make a snippet of your audio, you upload it, you get a picture, and you must have seen them because it's basically a picture with like the wavy lines and the little transcript, and it's a lovely way of picking the best clips from your podcast and making them so you can share them on social media. So, bearing in mind that the Twitter limit is 2 minutes and 20 seconds, as I found out the hard way, but you can make kind of minute and a half clips, and that's a really good tool for bringing people in and interesting them.
Yeah.
I have a question for you all, actually. Do you think it's better for somebody to have a website for the podcast in terms of, like you said, the newsletter, or can they just have their podcast on a hosting site?
Personally, we've done both for clients. It also depends how much they're prepared to pay. Like for Genetics Unzipped, we have a whole website because we wanted, the transcripts and all this place to live. The easiest thing is just to have it on a host like Libsyn or something like that. But, if you have your own website, then it really is a destination, and you can start to build out your content and that kind of thing, if that's something you want to do. Again, like what's useful, what's going to serve your bigger purpose in doing this whole enterprise.
Exactly. I started with a podcast website, and when it came down to the year subscription to have to pay again, I actually cancelled it because I wasn't finding the traffic was getting there. My purpose for it was to profile these makers, and so I made like a nice photo for them and did all their like links and website and stuff. But actually, I think people didn't go from their podcast app to the website to look at those makers. They would just wanted to see that information in the show notes itself. So once I understood what my listeners were, how they were using that information, then I could decide that I didn't actually use that website. So now there is a bit on my own personal website for the podcast, but it doesn't have its own dedicated page.
So yeah, I think we just got a really good question in, asking us a bit more about the technical details.
We've like playing podcast bingo. We've had the question about the mic.
Yes, yeah. So first of all, what kind of mic do you use? Let's go around the circle, I guess.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what mic you use. It really doesn't. You can make a podcast on a phone. You can make a podcast on your computer. As long as it doesn't sound absolutely shit. Just start with the mic you can afford. It's the least important thing.
And in fact, as a challenge, I dare you to listen to an episode of Gorilla Science Presents and figure out what was recorded over Zoom, what was recorded on a phone, and what was recorded in a studio. It's going to be really difficult to pick out.
Exactly. We record interviews where we do it over Zoom, and then we get the guest to record on their smartphone voice memo app, and then use that as the recording, and it's usually fine.
Yeah.
I'm so relieved that you guys said that. Everybody asked me that, and I honestly, like you said, I do it by Zoom. I think those are the things that hold people to a crutch, because you're so consumed on the technical stuff sometimes. And not saying it's bad before somebody comes at me, but I mean, if you can and you have the means and you have the money and you know what mic you need to do, by all means go for it. I have to say, personally, in the beginning, I was like, oh, I need to get a mic. I got a completely wrong mic. It was a waste and I didn't even use it. It wasn't able to connect to my computer. And then I had to go back to using my phone. So like you said, I don't think personally that it's a major deal. But I mean, if you have, then that's really great. It obviously helps the quality, but just try and get the audio to be as good as possible and you have a really great piece of content.
And I feel like we should say that we're laughing because we've all been through like the obsessive stressing only to realize like just use a phone or just use Zoom. Like we're laughing because we've been there.
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's when you're listening to it, it's like, am I struggling to listen to this? Does this sound bad, or does this actually sound okay because it's interesting? Although the one thing that I am a bit of a pedant about is generally I do think that audio should be edited. If you have infinite BBC time, you can take out every breath and every and every but yeah, it's like actually spending some time, and there's a free online tool called Audacity, which is a very basic audio editor. It's a bit clunky to use sometimes, but it's a really good place to start. Is there flab? Are there fluffs? What is making people kind of stumble a bit when you're listening to this? Because the tighter and the more focused and more interesting you can make something, the more likely someone is to listen to it. Your goal is to make something that will engage your listener, and usually a bit of editing at least is a good way to make sure you achieve that, in my personal opinion.
I do agree. I think when I first started doing my podcast, I spent hours and hours and hours editing every episode, taking out every awkward pause. And now I don't do that at all. And I think the listener is the human ear will blank out a lot of that stuff for you. And audio quality as well. We're very, very good at coping with relatively poor audio, still enjoying what the person's saying. So yeah, I think my key message is don't worry too much about the editing because the audience will forgive you for a lot.
And the next part of that question is, what kind of environment do you prefer? For me, I think if it's a quiet room, you'll be fine. I don't know if anyone had anything else.
Soft furnishings. So I mean, again, you can clap your hands and see if your room is echoey. Actually, I've behind my banner, see if I can do it without pulling it over. It's my little podcast booth, which is a foam Z bed with a duvet over the top of it. And so I just sit in front of that. And it just helps to make it sound a bit more dead.
That's really cool.
You can just put a cushion in front of you or something like that as well.
Yeah, a cushion, a towel over the desk, anything like that helps.
Yeah. At some point, I was using the closet. That helped as well. The clothes.
Classic.
So,
I did go a little bit to the other way and really covered myself in a duvet, and it was it sounds like I'm dying. It sounds like I'm in a coffin.
Yeah, and I think actually in the pandemic, so I used to go and do interviews in person and all this kind of thing. So I'm a radio person, and this is how we do it. And we've all got a bit more forgiving, I think, because even the super professional podcasts are we're just all doing this at home. Everyone's at home. It's fine. So here's a dog. There's a child, but generally, I mean, the obvious things to avoid are things like music in the background, really loud ticking clocks, all that kind of stuff that's distracting, and also partners who just seem to slam the door and flush the toilet right in the middle of an interview. So just kill them. Yes.
And we've touched a little bit on how you edit the audio. We've mentioned Audacity, that free online tool, which is awesome. So yeah, we've got a few other questions, so I'll try and snap them in next. So do we have any tips on how to make a podcast release schedule and how to stick to it? I personally don't, because all of our episodes were delayed. So anybody else?
I guess the easiest way you can do it is to stack up quite a few episodes and have them ready to go, so that you're not, if you've got a weekly release schedule, you're not recording, editing and releasing it all in the same week. That for me is the best way to take the pressure off. And also set your release schedule realistically, I would say.
Yeah, consistency is better than, if you can commit to it once a month and do it once a month, it's better than doing we've done 3 in a week and then nothing for 6 months.
Yeah. Agree.
Definitely.
And then we've got a question specifically for Anne. How do you manage to balance all the work that you do? I find it quite amazing and would love to hear how you manage your time so effectively.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, I'm a student and I'm doing this whole podcast thing, and I do various other things because, like I said, I'm really a major champion for amplifying the voices of Africans in STEM. I'm part of an amazing organization called Visibility STEM Africa. So how I do it, I sleep really early and then I wake up really early. That's how I do it. To be quite honest, I'm a person who sleeps very early. Like by 9, I'm out, and then I'm up 3:30 in the morning. And yeah, that's how I do it. And also, I've really amazing support system. I have an amazing supervisor who is understanding. I have amazing family who, when I am recording, like Kat said, I'll be like, everybody don't make noise. And then people just know that, like, try not to breathe too loudly. So yeah, I have some really great support system, and that's how I'm able to do it, I suppose. I mean, it's not always easy. And just to add on that with the podcast release schedule, initially when I started doing this during the pandemic, I had a lot of time in my hands, early March last year. So I was like, I'm going to release twice a week. Oh, it's crazy.
Wow.
I know. I was like, yes, I'm going to do this twice a week. And it was great. It was really, really. Then I was like, oh my God, this is really, really hard when life started to get a little bit more normal. So I just have to say, with your podcast schedule, you also have to forgive yourself. You know, sometimes you might not be able to release on that particular day. I used to really hold myself and like stress myself out. So I'm sure you can put a little note to your listeners, like it might be delayed or whatnot. So, because in the end, especially if you do it by yourself, everything by yourself, you are human.
Yeah.
You can't control everything. So also just be kind to yourself when you're releasing, and your listeners will be there. I learned that, and I was like, oh my word, people are still listening. So yeah, be kind to yourself when you are trying to stick to your schedule, and adjust if needs be. If you can't do twice a week, then move to once a week or once a month, whatever works, so that you are not crazy at the end of it.
Another thing I'll say is that, and increasingly you see it, like podcasts are coming out in series. So, you know, you'll do 8 and then have a break, or 10 and have a break, or even 6 and have a break. And, you know, as long as you're clear, like, okay, this is what we're going to do. We have a series and then we're having like a series break. And, you know, once you get to a point where you've got quite a lot of back catalogue, you can just rerun your favorite bits if you've got that kind of podcast. So that's also just a really nice way to take stock, catch up on yourself, get a few more in the can. So you're not just constantly on this grinding treadmill trying to chase your own tail.
Definitely. So another question, we've got about 5 or so minutes, so if any other questions, get them in while you can. How do you feel about drops, interstitial music and that kind of thing? Enhancing or annoying? I like this question.
I think it's entirely a matter of personal taste, and like, you know, make the podcast you want to make.
Yeah.
For me, that just sounds like loads of editing effort, so I would never do it, but I don't mind it on other people's podcasts if they want to go to that effort.
I think they can be nice, like if you just want to give people a moment to like sit with what's just been said, or like a moment of reflection. Too many is obviously a bit chaotic, but I think, if used appropriately, I always like a little bit of interstitial music in a podcast.
I mean, with the Genetics Unzipped narrative episodes, like the whole thing, they're built around this sort of story, the script that I'm reading, and then the music and some sound effects to kind of immerse people in it. But that's a style of podcast, and some people don't like it, and some people love it. And it's like, well, I mean, I'm making the thing that I like. So if you don't like it, I mean, you don't have to listen to it. Not making you.
So another question, it is known that most people find listening to their own voice very strange. Did any of you have this problem, and how did you get over it?
I I liked listening to my own voice, actually. Initially it was weird, it was strange, but I ended up I liked it, especially when I finished editing. So I was like, "Ooh, is that me?" Like I personally liked it. I didn't find it too strange, but I find that my guests find it strange and they cringe and they're like, "Oh, when you send them the audio to like, please listen before I, upload it," they usually cringe. So personally for me, I didn't have that cringe fest. I liked how my voice sounded.
I hated it for 20 years, still hate it, but I just get over it.
For me,
I'm
it's
kind of
like,
in the
that
middle.
moment. Oh, you're
Go
in the
on,
middle.
Rachel.
It's that moment like when you're about to rip off a plaster or like get into like an ice bath or something, and you just breathe and your eyes go like blank, and then you just like, I'm just going to do it. Like that's the space that I have to be in to listen to my own voice. So yeah, I think I can frame it as mindfulness, but I think I'm just like completely checking out. So how do you choose a platform or hosting service for your podcast?
Well, another one for the podcasters bingo there. There's lots of different ones. They've all got advantages and disadvantages. We self-host Genetics Unzipped through Squarespace. That was a terrible idea. Don't do that. Libsyn is quite good. Podbean is quite good. They charge different amounts. It depends on how much audio you've got, how much time you want, what your budget is, that kind of
And if
thing.
you want adverts,
Yeah,
if you want adverts, then
Yeah.
Acast is the one, because they just sort it all out for you. And then you get a little bit of revenue back for depending on how many people listen, but then you have adverts on your podcast. So
yeah. If you've got no ads, we used Anchor.fm, which is good. It pushes to Spotify and Apple Music and all the rest of it. Very
all the big platforms do push to all the distributors. So, but when we set ours up on Squarespace, I had to send the feed to everything, and it was a massive pain in the arse. So yeah, don't do
that. What platforms do you publish your podcast on before putting them on social media?
That's
so I
kind
guess
of the
that's
same.
kind of the same question. Yeah. But yeah, it's a good point. It's always good to wait until, it's been pushed from whichever kind of hosting place you're using till it actually arrives on Spotify and Apple Music. That can take a bit of time. So keep that in mind when scheduling social media. So we had one question from a little bit earlier, which is, what is one thing you would have liked to have known before you started your podcast?
I mean, the thing I did know, which I think some people don't know, is that you're not suddenly going to get like thousands and thousands and thousands of listeners straight away, that every time you launch something, it's a slow burn. And actually, you have to view it as you are building interest and a listenership and a relationship. You're really building a relationship with your listeners rather than just like, here's the thing, world, everyone should listen to this. Because maybe that works for the big celebrity podcasts, but it doesn't really work for the starting from scratch ones.
I completely agree. I think when I first started, I thought that my measure of success was going to be number of listens. But actually, over time, my podcast hasn't grown in listenership that much. It's been very solid in terms of the number of listeners and the small number of listeners that we have. But all of those listeners are engaged. They get in touch on social media. They're kind of the right demographic that I'm aiming for. So they're, in my view, sort of quite high quality listeners. And so I guess I wish I knew that that there are different measures of success, and actually a smaller audience of very engaged, good listeners who you're trying to reach is much better than a huge audience of people that aren't that engaged.
Yeah. For me, I think it's that I thought it would be so easy because I just thought I was just going to be talking. I learned the hard way that I'm learning more and more that for it to be really good and to be consistent and to produce quality content, it requires a lot of work. And I'm also learning that, I wish I knew that, I think somebody mentioned it earlier, about getting help. If you can get help in the beginning, learning to relinquish control, especially if you're doing it by yourself, and just get some help if you can. I think that is so, so important because it's hard.
Yeah. I think like podcasting is definitely, you know, a doing experience, but it's also a big learning experience. Yeah, and I think just being open-minded, like, was the best thing about it for me. I think I took on a lot, and I think I didn't know that before, and I guess it didn't hurt not to know it. But if I'd have known like how just awesome it would be as an overall experience, I think I would have gotten started sooner. So maybe that's my take on it. And I guess we've got a little bit of time, so there's been one more question, which is a bit less heartwarming, but great all nonetheless. How do you make podcasts pay?
Shall I start here?
Please, Pat.
Find an organisation that will pay you to make them. Is my top recommendation, which is difficult. Is because, you know, it's trying to persuade organizations to invest in the long term and not just say, okay, make us a series and we're expecting to have thousands and thousands of listens. And that's really what it comes down to, again, of thinking, how is this going to serve the wider communications needs of this organization or this thing that I want to do? Once you have a reasonable listenership, you can start to get a bit of money from ads if you're going kind of self-funded. But it's certainly not easy, and certainly not easy for, you know, just starting an amateur podcast from scratch to make money. And it really is. It's like you've really got to invest in making amazing content, promoting it, using as many contacts as you can, and treating it like a real exercise. It's not just the case if you make something, loads of people will listen, you'll get ad money and it'll be great. That's it's just not how it works.
Yeah. And I think just to add on to that, there's also a question for us on the flip side, like, if we're really focused on bringing in voices that are usually underrepresented, it's worth thinking about, is there a way that, you know, I could possibly compensate people for their time as well? So I think the question goes both ways in terms of broadening who you're getting involved. So that's something I throw out as well. So I think that is it for our Q&A, which means it's time for us to round up the talk. I've definitely learned a lot. So thanks, Kat, Anne and Anna, and I'm Rachel, for having a great chat. Are there any final points or things you want to plug to put out there?
Listen to our podcasts.
Yeah. Yeah, we're all on social media. We're all audibly, you know, hearable. I've forgotten that word. So yeah, hopefully this isn't the last time we all connect. And yeah, I'm really excited for the rest of the Finding Ada conference. So thank you very much, Finding Ada, for having us here.
Thank you.